Hello and welcome to Stained Glass Gaming, where I turn video games into glass. Today, I am making the Plumbob from the SIMS series. I found an image online and scaled it to the size I wanted and made 3 copies. One copy is used to cut the glass, the second is used to check the fit, and the third is to solder on. I used 3-bladed scissors to cut the paper. The slit takes into account the width of the foil that is used to stick the pieces together. For anything I make, I always number the pieces to make sure I don't confuse which piece goes where. When I make things using images from the internet, I try and stay as true to them as possible, but sometimes I have to alter the image. For this project, I am using green patterned glass. The darker side will be the front, and the lighter side will be the back. Once the paper pieces are cut out, the next step is to glue them to the glass using washable glue. I arrange the pieces using the least amount of glass. When I use pattern glass, I try and incorporate the pattern into the design. I use a small amount of glue on each paper piece. If it extends beyond the paper, the glass cutter will become dull as it runs over the glue. This is a pencil type glass cutter. It has a very small cutting head and scores the glass as it runs across. Think of a score line as a crack, and when the glass breaks, it breaks along the crack. When I score the glass, I apply a moderate amount of pressure as I move the cutter. I should hear a zipping sound, which lets me know the cutter is scoring the glass. I move the cutter across the glass only once, and this is enough for the glass to break. Here is what the score line looks like. After the glass is scored, I use breaker pliers and line up the score line with the black mark, then squeeze the pliers. Cutting and breaking glass produces small shards that are unpleasant if they get into your skin. Think of it like a glass splinter. To contain the mess, I use a paintbrush and sweep the small shards off to the side each time I break the glass, and repeat the process until all the pieces are cut out. To break the smaller pieces, I use small pliers, where one side is curved and the other is straight. I score the glass as close to the paper as I can, then turn the glass over and lightly tap it. The tapping helps the crack travel through the glass, making it easier to break. If the glass is too small to hold comfortably with my fingers, I'll use a paper towel to hold the glass. With the curved side of the pliers down, I squeeze the pliers while pushing down on the glass. Ideally, the glass should break into small chunks, but because this glass decided to shatter, and instead of struggling to contain the mess, I move on to the grinder. I fill the grinder about half to 3/4 full of water. The water keeps the grinder head and motor cool as it operates, and reduces the amount of glass dust produced. This is the holder for the sponge and acts as the dust suppressant. The water soaks into the sponge and presses against the grinder head. The grinder throws small particles as it grinds against the glass, and so I use a grinder shield to contain the mess. Grinding is the messiest part of the entire process, and I wear clothes I don't mind getting covered in glass. I wear a long sleeve shirt, pants, shoes, a hat or bandana, safety glasses, dust mask or respirator, and a fan. The grinding head rotates counterclockwise. Moving the glass from right to left produces deeper cuts, while left to right produces shallow cuts. There are 2 ways I grind the glass: holding the glass with my fingers and using a grinder cookie. The grinder cookie saves fingers from the wear and tear when holding the glass. I apply a moderate amount of pressure as I grind. If I use too much pressure, the shaft of the grinder will bend over time. As I grind, the paper becomes wet, and because the glue is washable, the paper may slide off. To keep the paper from sliding, I alternate which piece I grind while I wait for the paper to dry. I use the second paper copy to check the fit of each piece as I grind. Once the pieces are ground and fit nicely together, I remove the paper. Because the paper is wet, I can remove it easily. If the paper was dry, I put the pieces into water to soften it. To get the glue and glass particles off the glass, I wash the pieces using hand soap and water. Then I dry and number them. Once the pieces are dry and numbered, foil is wrapped around the glass to solder the pieces together. One side is copper, and the other comes in 3 different colors: copper, black, and silver. Choosing the foil backing is dependent on the color of the solder. Solder is naturally silver, but can be changed to copper or black using chemicals. If the glass is opaque, meaning little to no light passes through, I use the copper-backed foil. If the glass is translucent, meaning some light passes through, or transparent, meaning all light passes through, I use the black or silver backed foil. For this project, I use the black back foil and will change the color of the solder to black. The width of the solder lines are determined by the width of the foil. This is the 1/4 inch width black backed foil. The black side is the adhesive and sticks to the glass. There are several ways to foil: using a hand foiling tool, a table foiler, and eyeballing. Since I don't have a hand foiling tool or a table foiler, I'm going to eyeball it. The adhesive side is covered with paper. Once I peel the paper off, I line up the width of the glass with the middle of the foil. I use the third paper copy to check the fit as I go. For each piece, I foil an inside edge that meets another inside edge. This provides a better fit when all the pieces are soldered. I start foiling on the top inside edge of piece number 5. I want the width of the glass to be in the middle of the foil as much as possible as I wrap the entire piece, pressing the foil onto the glass as I go. The sides of the foil will be pressed down later. When I get to where I started foiling, I overlap the foil and cut it using regular scissors. Before I press the edges of the foil onto the glass, I take an X-Acto knife and cut the corners. To press the foil onto the glass, I use a burnishing tool, but a popsicle stick would work just as well. I use my fingernail and push the foil over the edges of the glass, then use the burnishing tool to flatten the edges and go over the entire piece again to ensure a snug fit. I noticed I was not lined up with my foiling and have an overlap on one side. I used the X-Acto knife to cut away the overlap. Here is what it looks like once all the pieces are foiled. The next step is soldering. I use thumbtacks to keep the pieces from moving and to do fine-tuning if needed. To begin soldering, I use 60% tin, 40% lead solder, a small paintbrush, flux, a soldering iron stand, a wet sponge, a dust mask or respirator, and a fan. I plug the soldering iron in and wait for it to heat up. While I wait, I brush flux onto the foil. Flux is used to stick the solder to the foil. Without it, the solder will bead up and roll off the foil. To test if the soldering iron is hot enough, I touch the solder to the tip. If the solder melts easily, then I begin soldering. The first thing I do is tack the pieces on the front and then the back, always keeping the iron moving and never leaving it in one place. Once that is done, I can remove the thumbtacks and solder the rest of the piece. I repeat the process of fluxing and soldering, but need to be careful not to heat up the piece too much because it will crack. Smaller pieces heat up faster than larger ones. When soldering the edges, the term is called tinning and is used to describe the action of putting a thin coat of solder over something else, which in this case is the foil on the edges. The solder can be reused if it drips off the piece. As I solder, the tip becomes oxidized and forms a layer of carbon on the surface. I rub the iron on a wet sponge until the oxidation is removed and the tip is shiny. To hang the piece after it is finished, I make a hook using small diameter copper wire. I cut off the amount I need and use needle nose pliers to bend the wire into a hook. The hook also needs to be tinned, so I apply flux and tin it. The hook is soldered on the back of the piece and in a seam instead of the edge, because the seam provides a stronger fit. Now that the soldering is finished and the piece is cooled off, I wash the flux, residual solder, and permanent marker off using hand soap and lukewarm water, then use a paper towel to dry the piece. Now I can turn the solder black using a chemical solution called a patina. I use a plastic container and an old toothbrush. I wear gloves because the patina will stain clothes and skin. I pour a small amount of patina in the container and begin scrubbing the piece. The solder immediately turns black, and now it is just a matter of making sure I get in all the nooks and crannies. Once I am satisfied with how it looks, I wash off the remaining patina with water. The patina won't come off the solder, just the glass. I dry the piece and use window cleaner to clean the glass. Over time, the solder will oxidize. To prevent this, car wax can be applied to the entire piece. I didn't have any when I was recording, but I will for the next video. And here is the Plumbob from The Sims. The sun was not in the best position to show the piece using natural sunlight, and I had to use an artificial light instead. If you have any suggestions for how I can improve future videos, let me know down in the comments. I already have plans for more videos, but after that, I'll start taking viewer requests. Thank you for watching. Like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.